Hello, this is Alex. Welcome to Socialism Survival Podcast number 26. In this show, I continue to share my personal story of survival in not so far places. My friends, this is the real story, not a fiction. This is a real account of what socialism did to me. So you'll get the picture of what it can do to you. As this socialist president says, let me be clear. I am not trying to present myself here as a hero or super strong, tough guy. No, this is just a story of survival of one simple Soviet man, one of many who survived or didn't survive. Obviously, my persecution was mild comparing to those who didn't survive. They cannot speak, and therefore someone like me bears that moral obligation to tell the truth of the godless evil reality that socialism imposes on the nation that embraces it. With socialism, there is no government anymore to protect you, but political mafia that pretends to express the will of the people. And there is no legal defense against such mafia that becomes the law. Look, that's what I see in America now. Political mafia, which controls White House and Congress, builds legal shield to protect their thievery and murder, genocide against American God-believing right. And if or when they succeed, and with the passage of this health care or health scare act, they already did something. So they'll do the same to the rest of the world. Dear listener, you are about to hear what the socialist mafia did to me. After we will return to our main subject, following the short segment of community organizing for freedom. Have you ever been to socialismsurvival.com? Do not hesitate. Go there and be a part of Socialism Survival's growing community. By joining our forum, you'll also find there all previously recorded podcasts. Take time to listen and learn about Soviet socialistic healthcare propaganda, education, economy, gulag, and many other great subjects. Spread the word. Introduce others to this community and to podcasts. By doing so, you will help your fellow Americans to recognize and survive socialism and learn how to oppose it as well. Now, back to the subject, as I continue to share with you about my survival in not-so-far places. Last week it was part number 1 and now part 2 of the story. As you listen, please understand that these events happened years or decades ago, and some details got blurred in my memory. Therefore, I need to sharpen the edges by making corrections and additions to make it presentable in English, without having this story even ever before been put on any media, whether in Russian or Ukrainian. On the other hand, some details are still so sharp and painful that I may intentionally or unintentionally soften or even drop it. Don't judge me for that, please. As the story remains true and genuine, unedited by any fiction publisher. Even my wife, after listening, says, "Honey, you never told me that or that." Well, having so many things happened in my past, it is uneasy to recall everything in full at once. Some details will probably pop up in the future as missing puzzle pieces of this story, of which you are among my first listeners, and which I resume after this short music break. Unidentified military vehicle that picked me up from the underage detention center was as uncomfortable and dark as was the whole Soviet socialism machine, powered by the steam of propaganda deception and running towards even darker utopian future of communism. Two wooden benches along the walls, door in the rear, and a square-foot barred observation window in the top front. That's all I remember of that black box on the wheels. Soviet prisoners call it Raven for its color. After about 30 minutes ride, Raven stopped and I was ordered to step out, keeping hands behind and head down, instructed to follow the orders without any delay to avoid being shot, with loaded rifles looking at me. I was escorted inside the building. It was a small military jail in a century-old building with massive walls, probably 2 or 3 feet thick. In a room, I call it purgatory, under watchful eyes of internal military guard, I had to leave my hat, coat, and all other personal items like pencil, small notebook, family photos, and watches. From the very arrival, I was kicked, punched, and cursed multiple times. One of the guards offered me better treatment in exchange for my watches. Well, I knew should I refuse his offer, treatment would be even worse. I had to sign item list without my watches on it. Following purgatory, I was put in a solitary cell. It was about 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet high. When heavy steel door was locked behind me, here what I found there. 2x6 solid bed was raised to the wall on the right side. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. was only time when it could be lowered, and I had 8 hours to lay down and sleep. Another 16 hours a day I could only stay, walk, or sit. There was tiny metal stool with square-foot metal table on the left side, permanently fixed to the concrete floor. I would eat at that table 3 or 2 times a day, I don't remember exactly. I had to be careful, though, with how much to drink to be able to hold my bladder between scheduled toilet times, because individual toilet requests would anger guards, and they would punish by shortening sleep time or taking away pillow, for example. Being there was hopeless and depressing. One way I entertained myself was by playing checkers. Well, I didn't have real checkers. Using fingernail, I drew barely visible checkboard on the table. Being allowed to ask to read old newspapers, I would tear 12 white pieces and 12 pieces with black ink as black and white checkers. There, in the midst of hopelessness, I was a checker champion, using my imagination and old newspaper. When I heard guard approaching my cell, I covered the table with newspaper, pretending I was reading. Next thing I'd like to mention is food. It was delivered to jail from military kitchen. Aluminum bowl placed on the aluminum tray and pushed inside the cell through the floor level door opening. It wasn't food for enjoyment, but for survival. After finished eating, I had to push the tray out of the cell and the shutter of that opening was closed. Being locked, oppressed, having such uncertainty for the future like I had, made me wonder, where is God? Am I left alone with such thoughts? I discovered that tiny window installed deep in outside wall actually can be opened. I couldn't reach it by hand, but there was a steel rod attached to it, and when I pushed it, the cool wave of the fresh air hit my nostrils. Although I saw very little through that 6-inch square opening, what I could see was a sign from God. In my direct sight was small old church with many small domes and crosses on its roof. I guessed that probably the building where I was locked in could be a part of that church's property before Bolsheviks took over the Russia. Maybe Orthodox monks lived there, and now it was my turn to take their place. With such thoughts, I was able to have peace in my mind and could pray to God, thanking Him for everything. While days were passing by in uncertainty, I knew in my heart that soon I'll be in a different place. Would it be better or worse? I didn't know. And when it was the time for me to leave, I knew I'll be missing that golden domes with crosses atop. While preparing myself for the wars, like military tribunal and disciplinary battalion, I was surprised that my case was passed to civilian court, and I am being transferred to Matroskaya Tishina, or simply Matroska. The name in English means seaman's silence, famous Moscow prison that was a part of Soviet Gulag since 1945. Being transferred to civilian detention facility wasn't necessarily a good sign. I was still in the hands of Soviet punitive system, deprived of my liberty, although not convicted, but incarcerated for unknown period of time. Being picked up by civilian prison guard was different from military. There were no rifles pointed at me, but I was handcuffed while being transferred between two places early in the morning. In Matroska, I was uncuffed and put in large waiting hall with over 100 other men waiting to be processed. After 8 a.m., names were called and selected people were leaving to processing room. Another purgatories. My name soon was called, and here's what I had to go through. In a processing room, I had to undress completely, placing all my things on the table for conducting search prison worker. By the way, even my military document wasn't discovered in a shoe. Only later, when I decided, I gave it myself to the authorities. From the search room, absolutely naked, I had to enter medical examination room, where medical personnel of all ages and sexes looked at me, touched my body parts, and I, with very conservative background, had to withstand it. After medical examination, I got my clothes and shoes back. But like in military jail, I had to sign for some things being placed in storage for the time I would be there. After being kept in a temporary cell for a few hours, I was put in a cell where I stayed for the rest of my time there. I was in a cell of a special regime. It was the most strict form of incarceration. There I was, as the sheep among wolves, surrounded by murderers, state-level thieves. As probably all cells, that one was also overcrowded. Designed to hold maximum 30 men, it had 48 at one time, but never less than 40. Therefore, some men had to share beds. Some slept at night and others during the day. Beds had two levels. Lower level beds, especially by the window, were occupied by so-called thieves in the law, who usually were respected as the authorities in Russia's criminal world. Entering the cell, I found the sink and a toilet with waist-level barrier on the left, and was greeted by a man on a closest lower-level bed, who was assigned by the thieves in the law to interview every newcomer. To my surprise, I passed interview well. As a new cell resident, I was assigned to wash dishes and got few hours of sleep on upper level. At least not on the floor, where only those with low reputation slept, like pederasts and rapists. Thieves were interested to hear about my story, my faith, and often invited to sit in their midst. Although they liked to ask some tricky questions, trying to catch me on inconsistency. They were testing to see if my faith was real, and I passed that test as well. The harder tests were still ahead. After approximately 1 week in Matroska, official interrogator was assigned to my case. Thanks God he didn't abuse me physically, but rather it was psychological torture. The tactics he used were like this. He pretended to be a nice man, almost like my friend, and then suddenly hit me with questions like, "Do you ever want to see your family again?" Or, "Have you really heard the audible voice of God demanding you run from army?" When I told my fellow inmates how the interrogations were going, they predicted I would be convicted and get up to 7 years in a prison camp. Of course, there in a cell, not everyone was okay with my faith, and sometimes that was obvious. One guy who despised God, for example, put live bedbug in my ear while I was sleeping. That caused me a lot of suffering. In general, it wasn't easy to get used to bedbugs, as they were everywhere. Somehow, even if the light was on in the cell, they knew that I was sleeping and attacked me viciously. Every time I woke up with bloody bracelet-like swellings on my both arms. Because of that, I couldn't really sleep for more than 2-3 hours at a time. That kept me sleepy all the time, which was helping interrogator, but not me. Being exhausted by sleep deprivation and by washing 50 aluminum bowls 3 times a day with cold water and baking soda, I was at the point of breaking at every other interrogation session. And it was something I couldn't escape or simply refuse. One time, Mr. Interrogated ordered to take me to psychiatrist. I was taken there handcuffed and with shackles on my ankles. That psychiatrist looked mentally sick to me, but now he was in charge of my life. After that visit, I stayed in Matroska for only few more days. Thank you, my friends, for listening to this podcast. To find out what happened next, come back next week to listen to podcast number 27. Before I close, I'd like shortly mention the passage of Health Destruction Bill. It doesn't matter if you agree with me or not, but I expressed my opinion on how Americans must act in podcast number 16. Please go there and listen. Those talk show hosts who urged all of you all to do just call, well, sounded like really disappointing to me. They who are able to reach millions on the radio could organize something more powerful to kill the bill. Sadly, it didn't happen. I hope, my dear listeners, that with your help this podcast will spread and maybe we will have the last word. At least we will be the ones who survive. Until then, I am your Socialism Survival host, Alex. Blessing you and America. We all love so much.